Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Listening Lounge. My name is Nick Day and I'm CEO of JGA Recruitment Group, and we're specialist payroll and HR recruiters. Now, they say the quieter we are, the more we hear, and that listening is the secret to discovering the greatest of stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's fantastic guest. Today, we're going to be tackling mental health in the workplace. And I'm joined by mental health expert Paul McGregor. He's a mental health speaker and founder of Everymind at work. One thing that's I find interesting is, particularly post-pandemic, we hear lots and read lots of reports about the impact the pandemic has had on mental health, the impact that new working environments have had, the pressures that we suffer. We're working longer hours. We're now in a different type of working culture where we want to move to an output-led culture, but actually there's that thought of, does my boss think I'm doing enough? We talk a lot about imposter syndrome, people feeling a lack of self-worth or emptiness inside. They achieve loads of different mental health considerations to consider. All of these things in play pre-pandemic. It's just that now we're talking about it more, or post-pandemic, have these been heightened? Is it now a more of a new pandemic, if you like, that we're experiencing as a result of what's gone before? Or is it just more in public consciousness? Are we just talking about it more than we did before?
It's a great observation. I get asked that quite a lot. Why is more people struggling with mental health now than ever before? And my answer back to that is that the truth, or is the truth that now we're talking about it? Was there a generation where they didn't struggle? I know my granddad struggled. He just didn't want to talk about it, right? He'd go to the shed, or he'd have his own ways of kind of keeping it to himself and managing it. And those generations before us, they're human. They're going to be dealing with pressures and challenges. Everyone has mental health. So I think it was more a fact of there was a lot more silence around it than there is now. And as you say, I think with the pandemic and with COVID, it's opened up more conversations of mental health. It's allowed people to feel safer and more comfortable to share that they're having challenges and they're struggling. And we shouldn't see that necessarily as such a bad thing. We see that a lot in organizations, to be quite transparent. It's like we hear a lot of people saying, we want 0 cases of work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. But are we actually then trying to reach a goal where we're eradicating human emotion from the workplace? Or is the actual goal that if one of our team members comes forward and says, I'm really struggling at the moment, I think I need some time off, that openness and honesty and vulnerability was never there in the workplace. That would be, I need 2 weeks off because I've got, a physical illness, and it would be masking the mental health challenges you're experiencing. So yeah, I think it's a great observation. I don't necessarily think more people are struggling. There's lots of more challenges that we have to face. I just think the awareness is increasing, which brings more light to a lot of challenges that we're seeing.
There's a word you use, which I really like, which was the word vulnerability. And you mentioned at the start of the show that you'll try and be vulnerable today. But the reality is, the more vulnerable we are, particularly at leadership, so you're a founder of your business, hopefully a founder of my own, if we're vulnerable, it allows our company and those that work for us to feel like they can be more vulnerable, and it can filter down. I highlight that because we've got HR leaders listening to this, that in my opinion, if we can get the stakeholders, the senior directors, to start this process of A, talking, and B, showing more vulnerability, the hope would be that's more likely to filter. But in your experience of working with businesses, is this a real difficult challenge to overcome? And if it is, what are the obstacles that are preventing us from getting stakeholders and senior people at the top of businesses to be more open and to be more vulnerable?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely more discussion that we need to have around vulnerability as a whole in the workplace, because I think we have an idea and a picture of what vulnerability means, and that's different for everyone. But for example, if I come into an organization, talk openly about, my dad's suicide and my challenges and everything else, people are like, whoa, this guy's way too vulnerable, right? But at the same time, what's the really important part of that is it took me so long to get there. It was so difficult for me to say to just someone, my dad's passed away. Like that was vulnerability. It then took me even longer to say my dad died from suicide. It took me even longer to be able to, talk more openly about those experiences. So what I'm getting at here is vulnerability. There's degrees to it. And I think from a senior leader point of view, or anyone in the business, we're not saying start at the most dramatic, life-changing experiences that you've had. Maybe start at the beginning. Like vulnerability is me saying to my team, you know, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of work that I've got going on at the moment. Or it's me saying that, you know, my 9-month-old hasn't been very well the last few weeks. I haven't been sleeping very well. So, you know, apologies if I seem a little bit distant on this team call today. Like, it's things that we feel comfortable to share and things that we're in control of sharing. So again, you know, I'm very open and honest about a lot of experiences, but there's so much that I'm not going to share with my team. There's so much that I'm not going to share on a talk. There's so much that I'm not going to share on podcasts still, because I've still got to peel those layers away myself before I feel comfortable to share that. So from an exec point of view, you know, sometimes I hear from HR professionals, you know, our exec team just won't engage, they won't share. Sometimes we have to get them on a different level and get them to see it differently. You know, maybe it's them sharing a time when they had to be resilient, or maybe it's them sharing about the day-to-day pressures that they experience in the leadership team. Or it could be, you know, have their children ever experienced, you know, mental health challenges, you know, and just trying to get them to talk a little bit more openly in a way that they feel comfortable. If we try and get them to share too much too early on, they're going to close up and I'm not going to get involved. But yeah, can we just get them to show a little bit more human side to it? And then that will start to unravel as time goes on.
I think something that I've discovered, and maybe it's due to my age, I don't know, but I think it's more likely the older we get, is that everyone, and I don't think there's any exception to the rule, at some point in theory is going to suffer some level of trauma that gets to the end of it. And I think we sometimes make an assumption that when we talk about workplace mental health, that we're only talking about stresses that the work creates. And you mentioned a couple of things there, you know, having a young child might be unwell. Actually, that impacts us at work. And there may be a traumatic event that we experience, losing a parent, losing a sibling, whatever it might be, or just illness, or it could be a multitude of things that we know that are outside of work, but we still, you know, we're humans, so we're still going to wear that when we come into work. So in your experience, knowing that people do have different traumas, whether we disclose them, whether we don't, what have been some of the positive impacts of being able to share and being able to be vulnerable, being able to talk about mental health in the workplace? Because you mentioned earlier that, you know, a lot of people want zero mental health issues, right? But the reality is that's not human. It's probably not possible with the way that we are as people. But actually, if we can be more vulnerable, we can talk about it, then we can, I would imagine, and hopefully it's working in our business by partnering with you guys, that allowing our employees to feel more supported actually allows them to show their best selves at work. So they can play their best game at work. They can be their best selves, knowing they're being supported in that way. And that's my personal experience. Others may challenge me on that. But from an expert point of view, I'd love to see your perspective on the impact being open about mental health can have on the workplace.
Yeah, I think vulnerability is so overlooked. You know, it's so powerful. It's difficult. It's really, really difficult. There's a great TED talk on vulnerability by Brene Brown. She talks about vulnerability as emotional exposure, risk, and uncertainty. And if you bring emotional exposure, risk, and uncertainty into the workplace, it makes it more uncomfortable and more challenging. But as I've said, there's ways of us being vulnerable in ways in which we can control. But vulnerability creates authenticity. And when we have authentic connections with our team, of course, it creates more collaboration. You know, when we're coming up with ideas or whatever it might be, it creates confidence. Again, from a leader point of view, or again in a collaborative environment, if there's vulnerability in there, it creates confidence. You know, firstly, confidence in that team. If someone's leading with vulnerability, I might not have the answer here, but let's come up with some suggestions. But also vulnerability for every individual. What I mean by that is when I wore the mask at work and even outside of work, you're pretending and you don't want to be caught out. That's exhausting. You know, there's a great quote that says, when you struggle with your mental health, it's tiring, but when you struggle with your mental health and you pretend that you're okay, it's completely exhausting. So like me wearing that mask and being afraid of vulnerability was so draining, because I'm like trying to perform at work and I'm trying to like show everyone that I'm okay, but no one's seeing the commute into work when I'm in my car crying my eyes out, right? Because, you know, I don't want to allow anyone to see that and I'm trying to hide that. So again, when I've become comfortable with being vulnerable, there's more of a confidence from me that I can potentially be in a situation where the idea that I share might not be received well, or there might be something that I share that, you know, exposes me as an individual. But the main thing with vulnerability is it creates trust. And there's a lot of talk about psychological safety at the moment, psychological safety in a workplace, reducing stigma in the workplace. I think you have to have that trust. And it's something that I saw very early on when I started to share my story about 6-7 years ago, and I was never prepared for it. Here's my story. Here's what happened to my dad. I hope that it helps you. What I wasn't prepared for was people coming back and saying, here's my story. Here's my story.
Yeah.
Here's what I went through. And I'm like, whoa, like that's vulnerability, because now they see someone as human who's been through an experience, and it creates trust that allows them to feel more comfortable to share. So again, there's so many benefits of vulnerability. And yeah, we just need to embrace it a bit more, because coming back to the point of having no work-related stress, depression, anxiety, absences, if you get people to talk earlier, it becomes more preventative. The problem with my dad is we didn't know there was a problem until it was too late. And then when he took his own life, his organization then did stuff about it then. The same with me. I left my job because I could not deal with it any longer. I couldn't deal with that environment where I felt uncomfortable to talk to anyone about it. So again, if we don't create that open environment, what we tend to find is people don't talk about it, but then when something happens, it's more drastic. They're leaving the business, or sadly, stuff happens. Whereas again, if we open up that conversation earlier, I might have a conversation with my manager in a more preventative way, which can then be dealt with, and then it can have greater impacts positively on the business as well.
I want to find out something that I read on your LinkedIn profile, actually, where you said that your biggest threat to your life is you. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it comes back to that statistic that men of under 45 years old, biggest killer is suicide. And we see that statistic sometimes, and we see how shocking it is. But I think sometimes when you flip it, and I'm a man of under 45 years old, I'm in that demographic. So actually, as I sit here, the biggest threat to me is me. As a dad of 3 boys, as a husband, as a colleague, whatever it might be, the biggest threat to me is me, because the leading cause of death of men under 45 is suicide. Yeah, so the reason why I try to use it as a bit of fuel is because already I'm saying to myself, I haven't really got time to go for that walk later, to go for that run later, things that I'm planning for my mental health. I've got a therapy session booked in for next week. I'm looking at my diary, could probably skip that, right? But at the same time, that reminder of what's the biggest threat to me right now, well, it's me. It kind of pushes me and makes me prioritize myself a little bit more. So it's a bit of a different way of looking at it, but I think we have to do all that we can to prioritize ourselves, our mental health and our well-being a bit more. And by looking at that statistic and saying the biggest threat to me is me, helps me do that.
You know what? It's interesting, and we talked slightly off air about this, but it links quite nicely to me procrastinating to a certain degree, right? So full disclosure at the start of my introduction, we are a partner of Everymind at work. We have your solution. We have the app is available to all of our employees. But I saw Paul's talk, for those listening now, watching this on video, over a year before I introduced that to our business. And it sat on my to-do list as something that I knew we had to do. I knew it was going to add value to our employees. I wanted them to feel supported before they reached any kind of crisis point. The story really resonated with me, and I thought, right, we need to put all our well-being efforts into one place. Let's do this. But it sat on my to-do list for over a year. It was there every day, every page, moved over, written again, and it just passed us. Because it probably wasn't a priority at that time for me. What suddenly hit me at home was, or when it came home, was actually, it's not always about me. I've got a workforce of 26, 27 other people that I've got to support. And just because I'm not at that crisis point doesn't mean that they're not. And it came to a point that realization hit me in the face, and I got someone else in my team to go, we've got to get this in place now. And actually was up and running in no time. And it was fantastic. And you guys have been great getting it on board. But a really good example, just to highlight what you were mentioning there, really, that actually, just because it's not, as a business owner, just because it's not my immediate priority, and yeah, it is easy for me to skip it, I'll do it next time. It suddenly dawned on me that it's not always about whether it's my priority or not. It could be a priority right now for one of my employees. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of The Listening Lounge. My name is Nick Day, and remember, every great conversation starts with great listening. Till next time.